Genesis 11, 1 through 9. At one time the whole earth spoke the same language. It so happened that as they moved out of the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled down. They said to one another, "Let's make bricks and fire them well." They used brick for stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower that reaches heaven. Let's make ourselves famous so that we won't be scattered here and there across the earth." God came down to look over the city and the tower these people had built. God took one look and said, "One people, one language. Why, this is only a first step. No telling what they'll come up with next. They'll stop at nothing. Come, we'll go down and garble their speech so they won't understand each other." Then God scattered them from there all over the world, and they had to quit building the city. That's how it came to be called Babel, because God there turned their language into Babel. From there, God scattered them all over the world. Wikipedia describes the Tower of Babel as an origin myth meant to explain why the world's peoples speak different languages. I think that's a pretty shallow reading. There's pretty good reasons to believe that it's probably not talking about that specifically. And in fact, the context of Genesis 11 being preceded by Genesis 10, I think, argue against that position, and let's take a look at why. Genesis 10 tells us that after the flood, the three sons of Noah went off in different directions, and they each spoke their own language. Good reason to believe that the original intent here was to show the separations of the people of the ancient Near East. That does describe how they were separated, but they already had different languages back here. Looks like by the time you get to Genesis chapter 11, most likely it's describing one of the particular descendants of Noah and how that group of descendants decided to organize themselves into a large city-state. Some of the sons were more rural, some of them lived more less organized, some became various great empires as time went on. Many of them were both friends and allies and other times enemies of the people that lived in what ultimately became Israel. I think this is a better explanation, and again, the chapter precedes Genesis 10 before Genesis 11, with each of the people having their own languages there. So I don't think it's a contradiction in the Bible, and I think it's a pretty clear indication that it's talking about a specific group of descendants of Noah's son, one of Noah's sons. Sometimes it can be helpful to look for parallels in other ancient Near East texts that describe similar situations. For instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes the flood with some parallels and enough similarities that something can be learned from the story. But the odd part about this story is there really isn't anything like it. The example that Wikipedia gives of the Sumerian and Assyrian parallel doesn't really come across as all that parallel when you read the text that they've described here. So and the other example they give is an Assyrian myth from the 8th century, but that would be quite a bit later, in spite of the fact that the biblical story here was, quote, written later. It would be compiled. If you believe the traditional view of the book of Genesis, it was written by Moses quite a long time before the 8th century BC, and these texts all existed in the time of the kings, quite frequently referred to as well. So it seems like sort of a liberal scholarship view here of the Old Testament, which isn't uncommon. It's quite common to find that view. But really, the interesting question is, what is the story trying to say, and how does it apply to us? Is it possible to find a contemporary parallel to the Tower of Babel? Can we find places where people gather together and organize to build large structures, to build organizations of themselves, and oftentimes end up perpetrating evil by their organization. This is a picture of the European Union, the EU headquarters. It has an interesting look to it. It looks almost like a partially completed tower. Very interesting. The European Union started out as a free trade zone, essentially, for Europe, so that the countries of Europe could trade goods back and forth, and it expanded over time to include the movement of peoples, and eventually the least common denominator policies of whatever country ended up becoming the official policy. So today you see immigrant crisis in many of these countries, where Germany, France, other countries are being careful about the word I use here. They're being I don't want to use the word. A similar mission to unite the peoples of the earth into one organization was is the United Nations. Although it hasn't been successful at that for many reasons, nevertheless, it really does make you wonder. Delegates from all over the world gather together at the United Nations. Boy, it almost looks like a pretty fancy church, doesn't it? Interesting. From the perspective of the Bible, the ancient Near East is a succession of one empire after another, each empire that wanted to rule the world. Much of the conflict in the Middle East traces back to a statement from 1917 called the Balfour Declaration, where the British government determined that there should be a homeland in Palestine for the Jewish people. Although it doesn't take much digging to understand some of the history, the State of Israel was declared at the end of the Civil War. It's raged for 6 months in Palestine, and after the vote by the United Nations to partition Palestine between Palestinian Jews and Arabs, the UN themselves partitioned Palestine. The history from 1948 describes how quickly Israel was recognized as a nation. Now, I'm not going to weigh in on whether establishing the nation of Israel was a good thing or a bad thing for the United Nations to have gotten behind, but it's undeniable that it did get behind it and did establish the current situation. The United Nations themselves have taken up this question. The text from the UN itself describes the question. The text describes it as the problem of Palestine. It's hard to envision just how extensive the Ottoman Empire was prior to the end of World War I, when it was divided up by the United Nations, or at least the predecessors of the United Nations. Same idea. The modern partition of the Ottoman Empire into the states of the Middle East came off the League of Nations, which is the predecessor for the United Nations mandate, which granted French mandate for Syria, Lebanon, British mandate for Mesopotamia, later Iraq, British mandate for Palestine, and basically split up those countries under European control. All of this leads to the obvious question: have these organizations together of nations into the United Nations, the Economic Union, EU, European Union now, have they made the world a better place or a worse place? Is the Tower of Babel just an ancient story which is used to explain why there are different languages? Or could they be an ancient story meant to warn us of the evils of organization of many, many peoples into one group, and the power that wields. If you somehow made it this far, thank you for listening to the Rambling Itinerant Preacher.